"This filthy harbor is beneath me," Kalen Sterling said, loud enough for every patron in the Rusted Anchor to hear. "And so are you." He was the eldest son of the Sterling bloodline, heir to 5 centuries of Dragon Lord authority. He had come to collect a piece of garbage, and he wanted everyone in the room to understand that. He had never been curious enough to investigate. He did not understand why the 3 hunting dogs he had brought for the theater of the occasion had stopped moving the moment they crossed the threshold. Why they were standing perfectly still behind him puzzled him. Their ears were flat, their great bodies lowered, and their eyes were fixed on the woman behind the bar with the shorn coat and the calm expression. The woman was Zola, his half-sister, the one they had left in a snowstorm 16 years ago at -25 degrees. Somehow she had not died. He was not asking himself any of these questions. He was throwing his glass. Her name was Zola. She was 22 years old and the founder and silent owner of Aether Corp, the largest artificial mana production company on the eastern seaboard, operating under a second identity, Lady Onyx, that the Sterling family had never connected to the girl they had discarded in a blizzard. She had carried 3 bloodlines in her veins for every one of those 22 years and had never had a single person tell her what that meant. The question was not whether the Sterlings would pay for 16 years of abandonment. The question was simply when, and in what order, and with how much of an audience. If you're watching from anywhere on the East Coast tonight, drop your city in the comments, because this story about to go places you didn't see coming. Now, let's go back to the beginning. "This filthy harbor stinks of everything you are," Kalen Sterling said, and threw the glass. It shattered at Zola's feet. The sound rang through the Rusted Anchor like a small detonation. Every patron going still, their drinks forgotten, their eyes moving between the tall man in the silver coat and the woman behind the bar who had not flinched. "Father sent me to collect a piece of garbage. I did not think the garbage would be standing here serving drinks to lesser wolves like she had nowhere better to be." He looked her over the way you looked at something you were deciding whether to bother stepping over. 16 years ago they threw you out in a blizzard, and somehow you didn't freeze to death. Tonight, I'm beginning to think nature made an error. Zola looked at the glass on the floor, at the shards catching the candlelight, and then she looked at Kalen Sterling, her brother. Technically, by blood, if not by anything else, and she felt nothing that resembled the thing he wanted her to feel. Behind him, the 3 hunting dogs he'd brought for the theater of intimidation had gone very quiet. They had stopped growling approximately 30 seconds after walking through the door. She had not looked at them. She had not needed to. "Kalen," she said, "pick up the glass." He blinked. "You're coming back to the castle tonight, whether you like it or not. Father's orders. The Blackwood ceremony requires a Sterling signature. And since Vivian can't pick up the glass," she said again, and her voice was not louder, not colder, not anything that could be described in terms of temperature or volume. It was simply a voice that expected to be obeyed, and had learned through long practice that it generally was. The 3 hunting dogs sat down. Kalen Sterling did not pick up the glass, but he also did not finish his sentence. And that, Zola decided, was enough for tonight. She untied her apron and set it on the bar with the particular care of someone who intended to come back. Rafe, the old wolf who owned the Rusted Anchor, watched her from the far end of the counter with eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize what was walking out his door and feel the specific sadness of a man who could do nothing to stop it. "I'll be back by the end of the week," she said to him, in a tone that made it a statement rather than a hope. He nodded slowly, and did not ask her if she was sure, because he knew she was. That was one of the things about Zola she was always sure. Always had been. Even when she was 12 years old, and alone in the mountains, and the hunters were closing in, and the temperature outside would have killed anyone who had not learned to generate their own heat. She had been sure then, too. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door and walked past Kaelin without looking at him. The 3 hunting dogs parted to let her through. The carriage to Stirling Castle took 4 hours through the northern passes. Kaelin spent 3 of those hours telling her what she was expected to do and say, and not do, and not say, when they arrived. How she should be grateful that Father had even thought to send for her. How this was a tremendous opportunity she should not ruin with her characteristic stubbornness, and how Vivian had already prepared a guest room for her in the East Wing, which was generous considering everything. Zola watched the mountains through the window and said nothing. There was a particular quality to her silences that had always unsettled people. It was not the silence of someone swallowing anger, not the silence of someone planning, but the silence of someone who had already finished planning and was simply waiting for the relevant moment to arrive. She had learned it in the mountains, where silence was the difference between living and not. She had never unlearned it. Stirling Castle came into view just before midnight. It was lit from within by the amber glow of 100 manna-fed sconces, its towers rising against a sky, the deep blue-black of a winter night without stars. It was 500 years old, the Stirling stronghold. It looked it, proud and cold and built for a world that no longer entirely existed. A monument to a family that had been the most powerful dragon bloodline on the eastern seaboard for 4 centuries and had spent the last 2 being slowly outmaneuvered by their own pride. Zola had not seen it since she was 6 years old. She remembered it as larger. Now it seemed merely heavy, the way old things sometimes did, bearing their own history like a weight they couldn't set down. The gates opened without ceremony. She supposed she had expected something, not a welcome. Exactly. But some acknowledgement that a person was arriving, that a thing of consequence was happening. There was nothing. Only the gate swinging wide, and the carriage rolling through, and the sound of hoofbeats on old stone. Alistair Stirling was waiting in the great hall. He was older than she remembered, of course he was. She had last seen him when she was 6, but it was a specific kind of older. The aging of a man who had been handsome and powerful and had worn those things like armor and was now finding that the armor had its own weight. He stood at the center of the hall in formal robes of deep crimson and gray, the Stirling colors, and when she walked in, he looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not immediately classify. It was not guilt, exactly. It was not warmth. It was something more complicated. The expression of a man confronting a thing he had convinced himself was simple and finding that it was not. Zola, he said. Just her name. No title, no qualifié, no explanation. As though he had practiced something longer, and then, at the last moment, abandoned it. Father, she said. The word sat in the air between them, like something she had placed there very deliberately. She watched him flinch, barely, and then recover, and she filed that away. Vivian had arranged herself on the second step of the main staircase in a gown of powder blue. She had clearly chosen it for this occasion. She was Alistair's other daughter, not by Alistair's acknowledged wife, but by a liaison that the family had managed to make legitimate through a series of legal maneuvers. Those maneuvers said everything about how the Stirling family operated and nothing about how they should have. Her beauty was calculated in the way of someone who'd spent hours on each detail, the kind of perfection that showed plainly she had worked for it and wanted you to notice. Sister, she said, smiling warmly, and Zola registered that smile with the same automatic clarity she used to catalogue every object and detail she assessed carefully. She had the gift, had always had it. Even before she understood it, the ability to look at any object or substance and know exactly what it was. She saw its composition, its purpose, its provenance, its value and its danger. She had used it to survive, to build Aether Corp from nothing, to become Lady Onyx. She used it now to look at Vivian's warm smile, her powder blue gown, and her carefully arranged position on the staircase. She understood exactly what they were. "Vivian," she said, neutrally, which was the only tone that gave nothing away. The meal was set in the formal dining room, a space designed to make people feel small through its high ceilings and long tables. Zola sat where she was told, ate what was placed in front of her, and listened to Kaelin talk about the Blackwood Alliance with the particular enthusiasm of someone who did not fully understand it, but needed to sound confident. The Blackwood Empire was the largest supernatural territory on the eastern seaboard, governed by a ruling family of pure bloodline supernatural lords, of a lineage so old that historians argued about when it had actually started. An alliance with Blackwood would secure the Sterlings for another century. A failed alliance would end them. This was, evidently, what Zola had been summoned to help with, to stand in for the family at the Blood Oath Ceremony and pledge the Sterling bloodline in formal covenant. She found this interesting for several reasons she kept to herself. "You'll wear the ceremonial robes," Alistair was saying, "the ones that were made for your grandmother's generation. The blue ones, not the gold. The blue will be appropriate for your station." She noticed the pause before the last word. She noticed everything. "Of course," she said. It was after the meal, when Kaelin had gone to drink with his people and Alistair had retreated to his study and the castle had settled into its late-hour quiet, that Vivian appeared in the corridor outside Zola's guest room with a lacquered box held in both hands and an expression of careful, sisterly concern. "I know tonight was a lot," she said, "coming home after so long. I wanted to give you something to make the transition easier." She held out the box with a small smile. "It's a blood harmony tonic. Helps with the discomfort of shifting between different mana environments. I had it made, specially." Zola took the box. She turned it over in her hands. She looked at the seal on the lid, which bore a stylized crescent moon in silver wax. She opened it and looked at the small dark bottle inside, and she assessed it the way she assessed everything, not with effort, but with the simple involuntary clarity of a gift she'd had since birth. The bottle was full. Its contents were precisely what she had known they would be, from the moment she saw Vivian's expression when she held it out. Not a blood harmony tonic. A compound of dried field grass and animal-grade mana suppressant, the kind used in livestock facilities to calm nervous horses, designed to produce a particular smell on the skin, the heavy, damp smell of the lower animal breeds. The wolves who hadn't made it far enough up the bloodline hierarchy to smell like anything else. A product designed, specifically, to make a person smell like the thing Vivian had decided Zola was. She looked up from the bottle and met Vivian's eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I'll keep it." Vivian's smile became slightly more fixed. She waited for something else, some reaction, some hurt, some anger. Zola gave her none of these things. She simply set the box on the small table by the door and looked at Vivian with the particular patience of someone who was building something and had not yet reached the point where it needed to be revealed. "Good night, Vivian," she said. Vivian left, and the smile she took with her was more complicated than the one she'd arrived with. Zola sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the box on the table. She thought about a woman named Zelda, who would find this very funny, and sent a brief message through the private channel they'd maintained for 6 years. Then she lay back on the Sterling family's guest linens, watched the ceiling of a house that had once been her home, and considered patience, timing, and the satisfaction of a moment arriving precisely when you'd arranged for it. She did not sleep well. Not because of discomfort. She had slept in far worse places than a Sterling guest room, had slept in caves and on mountain ledges, and once for 3 days in the hollow of a dead tree, while a hunting party quartered the forest above her. But, because the house had a sound to it that she had not expected. Old buildings carried their histories in their walls. In the specific way, the wood settled, and the manor channels hummed, and the cold moved through the old stone corridors at night. Stirling Castle sounded like a place that had been very powerful once, and was still pretending. She knew that sound. She had built Aether Corp specifically because she understood the difference between actual power and the performance of it. And she had decided, at age 18, that the performance was worth infinitely less and cost infinitely more. She lay awake and listened to the castle perform and thought about the day ahead. In the morning, the household assembled for breakfast with the particular precision of a family that used rituals to manage the anxiety of existing together. Alistair sat at the head of the long table. Kaelin sat at his right. Vivian sat across from Kaelin in a fresh gown of pale green, looking rested and settled in a way that suggested she had slept well and planned to continue sleeping well. Tariq, the youngest, the one Zola had held in her arms exactly once, when he was 4 days old and she was 5. Before the year that everything changed, sat at the far end of the table, eating porridge with the concentrated attention of someone who had learned that breakfast was safer when you were not noticed. He was 18 now. He had grown into a young man with their father's bone structure and their mother's coloring, and an expression of careful quietness that Zola recognized. As a survival mechanism, she had not had time to teach him. He had developed it on his own. She noted this and felt something about it that she did not fully name. He looked up once during breakfast and found her already looking at him, and she watched the calculations run behind his eyes. Is this person safe? Is this person an ally? Is this person going to make my life better or worse? And she held his gaze steadily until she saw him reach a conclusion. He gave her a very small nod. She returned it. This was, she thought, the most honest communication she had had in Stirling Castle so far. Vivian watched the exchange from across the table. Her eyes missed nothing and gave nothing away. And that was its own kind of message. She had refilled her teacup twice. She was waiting for something. Zola found herself curious about what. The ceremony is in 3 days, Alistair announced, in the tone of a man reviewing logistics rather than announcing something of importance. The Blackwood representatives will arrive the evening before. There will be a formal dinner. He looked at Zola. You will wear the blue robes. I remember, Zola said. Vivian, he continued, will accompany as the secondary Stirling representative. As the Blackwood protocol requires 2 family members to bear witness. Vivian smiled at this. It was a small, satisfied smile. The kind someone gives when a carefully set plan shows it will reliably hold. Zola finished her tea and thought about Zelda, who would arrive today, and about timing, and about the particular pleasure of a plan that was already 3 moves ahead. She spent the morning in the East Wing Library, the only part of the castle she had wanted to see again. Not for sentiment, but because the Stirling Library held records of bloodline classifications predating the current taxonomic systems by 200 years, and she had never had legitimate access to anything this old. She pulled files and cross-referenced classifications with the methodical efficiency of someone who was not doing this for pleasure, but for purpose. What she was looking for was not in the Stirling family's own records, which were impeccable in their documentation of the dragon bloodline and entirely silent on the subject of anything that might complicate that narrative. What she was looking for was in the older materials, the pre-taxonomy folios that classified bloodlines before the Stirling family had any interest in the classification. She found what she needed at 10:30. She copied 3 sections in longhand onto paper she had brought from her pack, replaced the folio carefully, and left the library. She had not disturbed anything. Everything was exactly as it had been when she arrived. After lunch, she sat in the east courtyard. watching how winter light struck the old stone and thinking about architecture. She heard a commotion from the great hall. Raised voices and that particular acoustic signature of surprise spreading through a crowd at once. She walked toward it without hurrying, and when she reached the great hall, she found it transformed. Kaelin was standing at the center of the room looking wrong-footed in a way she had not seen from him before, his usual authority temporarily inaccessible. Vivian was in the process of going very still, the smile frozen on her face. Alistair had risen from his chair. Zelda of the Crimson Coven stood in the main doorway in robes of deep purple black, silver sigils running from shoulder to hem. She was Futui Toikau, Supreme Witch of the Eastern Territories, a woman so powerful her formal titles took 40 seconds to recite, and whose unannounced appearance anywhere was a serious event. She was perhaps 40, or perhaps 400, depending on how you counted certain things, and she was looking around the great hall of Stirling Castle with the mild, interested expression of someone who had arrived exactly where she intended and found the situation exactly as she had expected. Her eyes found Zola in the doorway. The expression shifted genuine warmth, the sort that grows slowly between people who'd earned it over many hard years together. "There you are," Zelda said. She crossed the hall in 8 strides and embraced Zola with the ease of someone who had done this many times. Over Zelda's shoulder, Zola watched Vivian's face go tight and unreadable. She filed it away. "We were just discussing your tonic," Zola said. When they stepped back from each other, she said it lightly, conversationally, in the tone of someone mentioning a small detail. Vivian's expression went through 3 distinct phases in the space of half a second. Zelda turned to look at her, and the warmth in Zelda's face did not disappear exactly. It simply moved aside to make room for something else, something that was very still and very precise, and not warm at all. "My tonic," Zelda said. Vivian's mouth opened. "Vivian brought me a gift last night," Zola said. "A blood harmony compound, sealed with your crescent," she said. "You'd made it specially." Zelda walked to the side table where the lacquered box had been placed that morning. She picked it up, opened it, held the small dark bottle to the light, and fell silent for a moment that stretched longer than anyone in the room, except Zola, found comfortable. "This is animal feed supplement," Zelda said, finally, in a tone of scientific precision, mixed with a grade 4 mana suppressant used in livestock management. The crescent on the seal is a reasonable forgery, but the sigil runs counterclockwise, which anyone with basic Coven knowledge would know is wrong. She set the bottle down. She turned to look at Vivian. "You used my name," she said, "to attempt to humiliate the person in this room I hold in highest regard." Vivian said, "I was only trying to help her adjust. You used my name," Zelda said again, and the second time it landed differently heavier, with the specific gravity of someone who was not going to be argued with on this point. "The Crimson Coven's formal relationship with the Stirling bloodline is secured by a treaty that comes up for renewal in 4 months. She looked at Alistair. "I would very much like to continue that relationship. The terms of continuation include the immediate and public correction of what has just been described to me." She picked up the lacquered box and held it out to Vivian with the calm, direct manner of someone handing over a consequence. "Eat it," she said. "All of it. In front of your family." Vivian looked at Alistair. Alistair looked at the floor. Vivian looked at Kaelin. Kaelin looked somewhere else. Vivian looked at Zola. And in her eyes, there was the specific fire of a person discovering that their plan has worked perfectly against them, that every move they made has landed exactly backwards, and that the person watching them understand this completely. Zola looked back at her with nothing in her expression except patient attention. Vivian reached into the box. She began to eat. The 2 days before the Blackwood ceremony passed in the particular way that time passed inside Stirling Castle, not quickly, not slowly, but heavily, weighted with the accumulated pressure of a family performing normalcy while everyone inside it was calculating. Vivian had eaten the lacquered box's contents before the assembled household, with a grimness that showed she was enduring a consequence she had earned but could not admit. The household watched in a silence not of discretion but of witnesses who understood they were seeing something significant. She had not spoken to Zola since. She moved through the castle in Zola's vicinity with the awareness of someone who had recalibrated a threat assessment and was not yet sure how to act on the new information. Kalen had retreated into his own preparations, which apparently involved long strategy sessions with men Zola didn't recognize in rooms he kept locked. She noted the locked rooms. She noted the men, their faces, the way they moved, the faint edge of something in their mana signatures that she would have classified as suppressed aggression if she had needed to classify it formally. Alistair came to her room on the evening of the first day. He knocked, which surprised her. She had not expected the courtesy, the acknowledgement that this was a room she could choose to open or not open. She opened it. He stood in the hallway with his hands at his sides. He wore the face of a man who had rehearsed the conversation many times and still wasn't sure which version to use. "I wanted to speak with you," he said, "about the ceremony." She stepped back and let him in. Whatever he had come to say was information, and information was always worth having. He sat in the chair by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed. The space between them was roughly 6 feet and about 16 years, and neither of them mentioned either distance. "The Blackwood alliance is important," he said. "More important than I can fully explain without context." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "What I'm going to tell you now, I should have told you before you were summoned. I should have told you many things before this." He looked up at her then, directly, and she saw in his face what she had partially seen in the great hall on the night she arrived, that complicated expression she had not been able to classify. She classified it now. It was a man looking at something he had thrown away and realizing, too late, that it was irreplaceable. Not regret. Exactly. Something with more pride in it than regret. And more fear. "The Blood Oath Ceremony," he said, "requires a representative of the Stirling bloodline who can stand the chalice test." He paused. "Vivian cannot." She was quiet, waiting. "Vivian's bloodline," he said carefully, "is Stirling on my side. Her mother was the classification is complicated." He stopped again. She watched him choose between several different ways to say the next thing and settle on the simplest. Vivian cannot hold a chalice of that age without damaging it. The Blackwood family requested the ceremony be performed with an authenticated chalice from the 4th century. Vivian would. The mana interaction would be wrong. He was telling her. She understood that Vivian was not fully Stirling. The bloodline running through Vivian was mixed in ways the family had never disclosed. A 4th-century authenticating chalice would reveal it. And the Blackwood Empire did not take being deceived during formal treaty ceremonies lightly. She was, therefore, essential. Not because he wanted her here, because the alternative was the exposure of a deception that had been running for 15 years. She let this settle for a moment, and then she said, "I'll be ready for the ceremony." He looked at her, surprised by the simplicity of it. No conditions, no recriminations, no leveraging of the moment. She did not explain that she had her own reasons for attending the ceremony. Reasons that had nothing to do with the Stirling family's needs and everything to do with information she had gathered in the library 2 days ago. There would be time for that. "Thank you," he said. The 2 words, sounding like a weight he'd been carrying, finally set down. She nodded. He left. She sat in the room for a while and thought about what it meant to be necessary to the people who had discarded you. and about the particular coldness of being right about everything. Zelda stayed. This was not a small thing. Zelda was the supreme witch of the Crimson Coven, and her schedule governed an organization that affected approximately 14 million supernatural beings across 6 territories. Her presence at Stirling Castle beyond a brief formal visit was unusual enough that Kaelin mentioned it twice in Zola's hearing, his pitch lifting as a man trying not to sound nervous. Zelda ignored this the way she ignored most things that did not require her attention, which was with complete serenity. She occupied the best guest suite, the one reserved for visiting dignitaries, with south-facing windows and a view of the formal gardens, and spent her mornings with Zola in quiet conference about matters other than the Blackwood ceremony. In the afternoons, she walked the Stirling grounds, observing with the attention of someone conducting an assessment. Evenings, she sat at the dinner table with the comfortable authority of someone whose presence shielded Zola from a pressure he could have handled but had no particular interest in handling right now. The Stirling boys been locked in that East Tower room again, Zelda mentioned, over the second evening's dinner, in a tone of mild interest. Kaelin's fork paused mid-motion. 3 different mana signatures going in and out. One of them I recognize from a trafficking report that crossed my desk last month. She picked up her wine. Interesting family you have. Zola. Kaelin set his fork down. Alistair said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Tariq sought her out on the morning of the second day. He appeared in the library doorway, uncertain. A young man performing uncertainty rather than performing confidence, which was something Zola respected. He said her name with the inflection of a question. She looked up from the folio she was reviewing and said, "Come in," and he came. In and sat in the chair across from her with the careful posture of someone who had learned that sitting carefully was safer than sitting casually. "Zelda said you built Aether Corp," he said, without preamble. Zelda said a lot. Zola said, "She likes information to move around. She thinks it's healthier." "Is it true?" He looked at her. He was trying to assess her the way she assessed things. Without the gift she had, but with the earnest effort of a young man who needed to know whether this sister, who had arrived out of his family's history, was a safe person to know. "Yes," she said. He absorbed this. "Why did you come back?" he asked. "Father said you were summoned for the ceremony." But Zelda said, that wasn't the whole story. Zelda is rarely telling the whole story herself. Zola said. She set the folio down. "I came back because I was summoned." "Yes. I'm staying because there are things I need to see through." She looked at him steadily. "Are you in trouble?" "Tariq." The question surprised him. She could see it in the slight change around his eyes. He had not expected to be asked about himself. "I'm always in some degree of trouble," he said. "I'm the youngest Stirling who isn't useful for anything. In a family that categorizes people by their usefulness." "That's not true," she said. He looked at her. "You're the only one in this family with functional judgment." He blinked. Then something shifted in his expression, something softening at the same time as it was reinforcing, which was what happened to people when they were told something true that they had not allowed themselves to believe yet. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "Stay close to Zelda today. Not close to Kaelin." He nodded, slowly, and then nodded again with more certainty. He left the library walking slightly differently than he had entered it. She returned to the folio and thought about what it meant to have family you could not afford to abandon. The Blackwood representatives arrived the evening before the ceremony. 3 advance members came with a formal escort of 8, carrying the sealed documents that would be signed, witnessed, and sealed in blood under the covenant. DeAndre Blackwood was not among them. The advance delegation was efficient and courteous, and said very little that was not necessary. Zola watched them during dinner, catalogued their mana signatures, reviewed the information she'd gathered in the library, and decided she was ready for tomorrow. Vivian sat through the dinner with the controlled expression of someone who had spent 2 days recalibrating and was not yet sure of the result. She had recovered her composure. Vivian always recovered her composure. Zola could assess that objectively, but this one felt different. There was a tightness around the jaw that hadn't been there before. She was watching Zola too carefully. She was calculating too visibly. These were signs of a plan in motion. Zola noted them and set them aside. It wasn't that the plan itself wasn't a threat. She had already decided how to respond to them, and the timing mattered more than the plan's specifics. On the morning of the ceremony, Vivian knocked on Zola's door. She knocked with the specific energy of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it. When Zola opened the door, Vivian stood in the corridor, holding the blue sterling ceremonial robes folded over her arms, her face wearing an expression of firm, sisterly concern. "The advance team reviewed the protocol last night," she said. "They said, and Father agrees, that because you've been away from the family so long, the mana recognition during the blood oath might not register correctly. Complications that could embarrass us in front of the Blackwood delegation." Zola looked at the robes. She looked at Vivian. "I should stand in for you." Vivian continued. "I know the protocols. I've been preparing for months. It's better for the family if I leave the robes," Zola said. Vivian blinked. "I said, leave the robes." Vivian, on the bed. A pause. "The advance team did not review the protocol last night. They retired at 9. I heard them, and Father did not agree to anything of the sort, because he had spent the last 2 days telling me I was essential to this ceremony and the only one who could perform it. So," she held Vivian's gaze for a long moment. During it, she watched Vivian make 3 rapid calculations and discard 2 of them. Vivian set the robes on the bed. She said, "The Blackwood heir is known for his temper. If he dislikes what he sees, it won't go well for you." She was trying, Zola understood, to hand over fear as a resource Zola might take from her. Something meant to create leverage. "Thank you for the warning," Zola said. "Close the door on your way out." She dressed in the blue robes. They fit better than they should have, given that they had been made for her grandmother's generation. She thought about that and decided it was interesting. She pinned the small gold Aether Corp badge to the inside of the left cuff, where it would not be visible unless she chose to show it. Then she went downstairs to the carriages and the convoy that would take them to the Blackwood Ceremony Hall, 40 minutes north. The sky was the color of old iron, flat and gray, the kind of stillness that felt like weather waiting to decide. She thought that was appropriate. The ceremony hall was a structure that made Stirling Castle look like a comfortable house. It was built in the Blackwood style, all dark stone and high vaulting and mana-channeled reliefs on every surface. The accumulated aesthetic of a family that had been shaping their architectural environment for a very long time. The hall could hold 300. Today, it held 112. All of them arranged with the precision of a formal event that had been planned by people who took formal events very seriously. The Stirling party was led to their seats at the right side of the ceremonial dais. Zola sat next to Tariq, who was slightly pale but steady, and across from Kaelin, who had regained his usual veneer of authority and was wearing it like a suit that didn't quite fit. Vivian sat 2 seats down, in a gown of sterling gray, which was the correct color for a secondary witness. The seat for the Blackwood heir was on the left side of the dais. It was empty. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. The delegation representatives exchanged quiet words at the front of the hall. An official came to speak briefly with Alistair. Vivian leaned toward Kaelin and said something very quietly that Zola did not quite catch. She filed this away as a thing she would return to. Then the doors at the rear of the hall opened, and the sound of footsteps measured. Deliberate filled the space from back to front. The assembled guests, stood. Zola stood with them and looked toward the rear doors. DeAndre Blackwood was not what she had expected. It surprised her. She was good at reading people, at building mental models from scraps of information, inference, and the secondary things that leaked out when others talked about someone. She had constructed an image of the Blackwood heir from the available facts. He was the eldest son of the region's most powerful supernatural family, exact, cold, and strict about protocol, to the point that 2 treaty ceremonies had fallen apart after representatives violated terms he called non-negotiable. She had expected someone severe, precisi, performatively powerful, in the way of people who have always had power and have no imagination about what it would be like to lack it. What she saw was a man who was all those things and also something else. It was a trait she hadn't built into her model, and she'd have to recalibrate for it. He was tall, dark-haired, and moved with the tight, efficient economy of someone who'd trained any performance out of his body until only function remained. His face, as he walked the center aisle, was as unreadable as she'd expected. But his eyes were different. The eyes were looking for something. He wasn't inspecting the assembled guests the way a man exercising authority would. He was looking, quietly urgent, like someone searching for a specific person. He reached the front of the hall. He looked left. He looked right. His eyes passed over Vivian, who was arranged in her sterling gray at the secondary witness position with all the careful readiness of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment. His eyes continued. They stopped. She felt them stop before she fully processed it. She felt the attention shift and land, and the air around her change the way it did when something significant happened. DeAndre Blackwood was looking at her, not at the Sterling party in general, not at the ceremonial dais, not at the assembled witnesses, at her, specifically, with the stopped expression of a man who has found what he was looking for and is processing the fact of having found it. He crossed the hall in 12 strides. He went past the ceremonial dais. He went past the delegation officials and the Sterling representatives, and then past Vivian. Vivian tracked him with her eyes, and with a face Zola would have called stunned. If Vivian looked capable of being fully stunned, he stopped in front of Zola. He went to one knee. He took her hand with the careful precision of someone handling something of value. He bowed his head over it. "I've been searching every harbor on the eastern coast for 3 days, he said, quietly enough that the words were between the two of them and the immediate air around them. "Because you left without saying anything. I am asking you, please, to not do that again." In the silence of 112 people, simultaneously processing what they were seeing, Vivian said, loudly, from her seat, "She's a half-blood. She's not even fully Sterling. She has no right to be here." DeAndre rose from the kneel, with the unhurried completeness tall people use, a slow, deliberate movement that made it hit harder than anything quick would have. He did not look at Vivian. He looked at Alistair Sterling, who was standing at the edge of the dais with an expression that suggested he was recalculating a very large number of things very quickly. "I am going to say this once," DeAndre said, and his voice was pitched to the hall now, the formal register of a man making a statement of record. "The Blackwood Empire will sign the covenant of alliance with the Sterling bloodline on one condition. Pause. The Sterling representative to this ceremony is Zola." He looked then at Vivian. "If the representative is changed, or if the Sterling family attempts to substitute another person, the Blackwood Empire will withdraw from this ceremony, dissolve the preliminary accords, and pursue the formal censure of the Sterling bloodline for bad faith negotiations." He looked back at Zola, and his expression shifted back to that quieter, searching, "Register, I'd also very much like to buy you dinner," he said, which was not a formal diplomatic statement, but was clearly also not a negotiation. Zola looked at him for a long moment. She looked at her hand, which he had not released. She thought of the badge on her inside cuff, the library folio, Tariq, and 16 years. She thought of the pleasure of a long plan finally arriving at its moment. The ceremony first, she said. Then we'll discuss dinner. She did not go back inside immediately. The ceremony hall was busy behind her, with the particular controlled energy of post-ceremony administration. Documents were being witnessed and countersigned. Delegation officials exchanged formal notes, and the Sterling family hovered at the edges of the room, processing what had just happened. Kalen was standing at the far side of the hall with his arms crossed. He watched DeAndre with a look Zola recognized as that of someone who had been outmaneuvered and was figuring out how to reframe it. Vivian was beside him. Vivian's face was doing something Zola had not seen it do before. It was not the warm smile composure or the controlled anger composure, but a third thing, stripped of performance. The face of someone who had prepared for a moment and found it completely different from what they expected. The Huihiu, the Aether Corp badge that Vivian had found in the rusted anchor and had announced confidently at the family dinner 3 nights ago as stolen property and evidence of Zola's low connections, was not that at all. Vivian now understood it was nothing of the kind. The Aether Corp badge was the insignia of the organization that had just underwritten a revised treaty with the Blackwood Empire. That treaty removed the Sterlings from a position of negotiating weakness they had occupied for approximately 40 years. The person who had worn it in a shorn coat behind a harbor bar was the founder of that organization and its confirmed first-tier bloodline holder. She stood in the Blackwood ceremony hall with her hand held by the Blackwood heir. Zola watched Vivian reach this understanding and felt, not triumph, but the particular quiet of a thing completing. She turned back to the water garden where DeAndre had followed her, and they stood for a moment in the courtyard air, which was cold and still, and entirely outside the ceremony hall's complicated atmosphere. "You should know," she said, "that I'm not going back to the castle in the Sterling family's carriage." He looked at her. "No," he said, "my carriage is available." She thought about it. She thought about Tariq and the East Wing and Zelda's knowing expression and the long road back north. "Tariq needs to be brought back safely," she said. "He won't ride with Kalen," DeAndre said. "My second carriage seats 4. Zelda is. I assume." Already aware of this, Zola thought about Zelda, who was, yes, almost certainly already standing beside the Blackwood second carriage with Tariq, and the expression of someone who had managed the logistics while everyone else was managing the emotions. "Yes," she said, "she is." He offered his arm with the simple directness that seemed to be how he did most things, and she took it, and they walked back through the ceremony hall, and its controlled energy, and its documentation, and its various consequences. And she thought about the revised treaty terms and the classification confirmation and about how much was still ahead, and found that what she felt about what was still ahead was not exactly anticipation, not exactly readiness, but something that was both of these things, and also something quieter and more fundamental, the feeling of a person standing at the beginning of a thing they have enough information to understand is going to be significant. She thought that feeling was probably right. She thought she was going to pay attention to it. The revised treaty terms took the Blackwood delegation 5 working days to draft. She reviewed them in DeAndre's administrative offices, not at Sterling Castle, not at the vault, but in a set of working rooms that the Blackwood delegation maintained in the harbor district for the treaty administration period, which were functional and quiet and had, she appreciated, very good light in the mornings. She reviewed the terms with her own counsel, Petra, a woman who had handled Aether Corp's legal infrastructure for 4 years. Petra read treaty language with the same precision she brought to financial documentation, and the two skills were, in practice, deeply related. Petra's assessment of the revised terms came as a 15-minute summary. It covered the principal changes, the 3 points warranting further discussion, and 2 clauses she recommended, adding to formalize protections the existing language implied, but did not state explicitly. Zola forwarded the recommended additions to the Blackwood drafting team. They accepted both without revision, which said something about how they had been told to approach this negotiation. She signed the revised treaty on the 5th day. It was witnessed by Petra and by Dasha from the Blackwood inquiry team, who happened to be present and was asked to serve as formal witness with the calm readiness of someone who was accustomed to being useful. The signing was unremarkable in the way administrative tasks finish. The process reached its end, and that felt satisfying in a quiet, specific way, without drama or ceremony. The ordinary satisfaction of good work when it is done. She kept a copy for the Aether Corp files, and sent a copy to the Sterling estate care of Tariq, and sent a summary to Zelda through the private channel, and had Petra file the originals through the Treaty Authority's official intake system. Then she went back to the vault for the afternoon, because she had been away from it for nearly 3 weeks, and there were things that required her attention. The executive director met her at the entrance with a status briefing that covered the 8 auctions that had occurred during her absence. The membership review outcomes for 3 accounts, including the Chandler families, and a request from the Hoingud-Thu Quirkte, the International Beast Taming Guild, to host a specialty auction at the vault for the following season, which she reviewed and approved with 2 modifications to the privacy protocols. It took approximately 4 hours and left her with the tiredness that comes from work well done. It was the best kind of tiredness because it resolved cleanly into sleep. She ate at the harbor restaurant she had been using for the past 2 weeks and walked back to her rooms at the Harbor Inn and sat by the window for a while before sleeping, looking at the channel lights in the water, thinking about nothing in particular, which was something she had not been able to do for several weeks, and found that doing nothing in particular was exactly as restorative as she had remembered it being. She did not sign the covenant. This surprised the Hall, Alistair, and the Blackwood delegation officials. Apparently it surprised DeAndre too, though he received the news with a look that separated someone who was genuinely attentive from someone who was merely polite. Zola stood at the ceremonial table with the document in front of her and the signing pen in her hand, and she said, "Before I sign, I have a question for the record." The delegation official managing the ceremony studied her with the careful look of someone weighing whether this was a procedural hiccup or a full catastrophe. The Sterling bloodline is represented here today under the classification of a 3rd-tier dragon lineage with 480 years of documented continuity. She said, "The Blackwood Covenant standard requires, for a treaty of this level, a 1st or 2nd-tier lineage, or a lineage with a minimum of documented continental influence." She set the pen down. She looked at the delegation official. "I'd like to clarify the classification under which this covenant is being executed before I sign." The official exchanged a look with his counterpart. Deandra, standing at her left, was very still. Alistair, from his seat in the witness area, said, "Zola, this is not. It's a procedural question," she said pleasantly. Without looking away from the official, "I'm sure the Blackwood delegation is accustomed to procedural due diligence." The official cleared his throat. "The covenant is being executed under the standard 3rd-tier classification." "Yes, wonderful," she said. "And if I were to represent a lineage that carried a higher classification, a 1st-tier classification, for example, would the terms of the covenant be revised upward, or would they remain as currently drafted?" A long silence. The official looked at her. He looked at DeAndre. DeAndre was looking at Zola. The terms would be revised upward, the official said carefully, per Blackwood protocol. If the representing lineage classification warranted it. Excellent, Zola said. She reached into her left cuff and pulled out a small folded paper. It was the excerpt she'd copied from the library folio 3 days before, and she set it on the table. I'd like to submit for the record a classification assessment of the Sterling bloodline that predates the current taxonomy by approximately 200 years. She unfolded it. Under the pre-taxonomy folio of the Eastern Continental Authority, the bloodline currently carried by a member of the Sterling family with trilineage heritage would be classified as first-tier singular, a designation that has not been achieved in recorded history and supersedes all other classifications in protocol hierarchy. She looked at the official. I'd appreciate the treaty terms being reviewed before I sign. The ceremony was suspended. The delegation officials said the suspension was procedurally necessary. They spoke with the controlled tension of people managing a situation that had run far from their prepared protocols. The assembled witnesses were invited to wait in the antechamber while the classification documentation was reviewed by the delegation's assessment team. Vivian, who had been watching the exchange from her seat with the expression of someone watching a building fall and being unable to determine yet which direction it would land, said, loudly, when the adjournment was announced, "This is a delay tactic by a woman with no legitimate claim to any classification above 3rd tier. She doesn't even have a stable bloodline reading." The delegation official looked at her. All classification claims submitted to Blackwood Protocol review are taken at face value until assessed, he said, with the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to complicated family dynamics at treaty ceremonies. The Sterling family's internal discussions about the claim are, of course, the Sterling family's business. Vivian opened her mouth. Zelda, from 3 seats over, said, without raising her voice. Vivian, 1 word. The silence that followed was a clear reminder of Zelda's name and the particular weight it carried in rooms where people knew her. Vivian closed her mouth. Alistair put his hand briefly on Vivian's arm. They went to the antechamber. DeAndre walked beside her through the corridor. The walls were paneled in dark stone with mana-channeled reliefs that, at intervals, depicted the major events of Blackwood family history. He was quiet for long enough that she began to think he was not going to speak. And then he said, "You went to the library before you came." "Yes," she said. "The Sterling Library has pre-taxonomy folios that most classification researchers don't have access to. You knew what you would find." She was quiet for a moment, weighing how to answer without giving more than she intended to at that time. "I knew what I might find," she said. "The trilineage configuration is documented in the old materials as theoretically possible, but the conditions for it are extremely specific and haven't been met in recorded history. So no one had seriously looked for it in a living person." "How long have you known you carried it?" She looked at him. "I've known something was different since I was 12. I had a classification theory for about 3 years. I confirmed it in your treaty documents this morning." He looked at her. "My treaty documents contain a lineage cross-reference appendix," she said, "that your family's treaty council includes as standard documentation. It's written in the old notation, which most people can't read anymore. I can." A pause. "You came to a treaty ceremony carrying a lineage classification that would change the terms of the treaty, which you discovered in a cross-reference appendix written in a notation most people can't read." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for another moment. "What would you have done if the classification review comes back negative?" "I would have signed the original terms," she said, and considered the legal research a useful exercise. He looked at her for a long time. "What do you actually want?" he asked. And the question was simpler than anything that had been said in the ceremony hall. Stripped of protocol and formality, and the careful architecture of their respective positions, she thought about Tarek and about the lacquered box and about a snowstorm 16 years ago. I want the classification on record, she said, officially, in Blackwood documents, which are the most comprehensive bloodline records on the eastern seaboard. Whatever happens with the treaty, the record exists. He nodded slowly, as though this made sense to him in a way he was still processing. And the treaty itself, she looked at the wall relief they were passing. It showed a battle scene, a depiction of a historical Blackwood victory rendered in the cold detail of people long gone. The treaty is good for the Sterling family, she said, on appropriate terms. They walked the rest of the corridor in a silence that felt different from what came before. She noticed the change and decided to pay close attention. The classification review took 3 hours. During those 3 hours, Vivian sat in the antechamber and spoke to Kaelin in very quiet tones about things Zola could not quite hear. Tariq sat beside Zola with a quiet steadiness, like someone who had chosen a stance and meant to hold it. Zelda read from a small leather book she had produced from somewhere on her person. She occasionally made notes in the margins. Alistair sat apart from all of them, by the antechamber window. He looked at the grey sky outside with the expression of a man doing a long and painful arithmetic. He came to her once, in the second hour. He stood beside her for a moment. She waited. If the review confirms the classification, he said, very quietly, I want you to know that what I did in sending you away. He stopped. He started again. You deserved better than what you were given, than what I gave you. She looked at him. She had thought about this conversation many times over 16 years, in different ways at different moments, and had prepared and discarded many responses to it. She found, now that it was happening, that what she felt wasn't exactly what she'd predicted she'd feel. It was more tired than angry, clearer than sad. Underneath both of them was a decision she had already made. Tariq needs a family, she said. He doesn't need you to be a good father. He's past the age where that would help. He needs to be seen as an asset, not a liability. He's a better strategic thinker than Kaelin, and a more honest negotiator than Vivian. If you used him as such, the family would be better for it. Alistair blinked. He had prepared for several responses to whatever he'd said, and none of them had been this. I'm not asking you to acknowledge what you did to me, she continued. I'm telling you what you can do going forward that would be useful. Use Tariq. She looked away from him, back at the room. He stood there a moment longer. Then he walked back to the window, and she heard him exhale, slowly, with the quality of a man setting something down. She thought that was probably the most useful thing either of them could do with the past 16 years. The classification review came back confirmed at the 3rd hour and 11 minutes. First tier singular. The Blackwood delegation official came back into the antechamber and announced it with the careful neutrality of someone delivering an unexpected result they had checked through 4 separate assessment protocols. He added that the treaty terms would be revised upward per Blackwood protocol. Vivian said, This is impossible. The official did not look at her. Kaelin said, The folio she used was clearly altered. The official said, The folio was cross-referenced against 3 independent Blackwood archival sources. The classification is confirmed. Alistair, at the window, said nothing. Tariq looked at Zola with an expression she recognized, the same one the young man had when he'd been told something true he hadn't allowed himself to believe. This time she let herself look back at him with something warmer than before. The revised ceremony was brief. She signed. The treaty was sealed. It was done. DeAndre found her afterward in the corridor outside the ceremony hall, which was emptying now that the formalities were completed. The delegation and the Sterling witnesses dispersing to their various carriages and obligations. He came up beside her with the directness that seemed to be his default mode of navigation, not abrupt. but without the social decorative movements that most people use to approach important things. The dinner invitation is still available, he said, if you want. She considered this. She thought about the badge on her cuff and the treaty document upstairs and the 3 months of revised terms that the Blackwood delegation would now spend drafting. I need to take care of something first, she said. Tariq, DeAndre said, which surprised her. He caught her expression. You mentioned him twice during the classification review period. In the context of things you were protecting. She looked at him. He needs to come to the Elysium Vault with me this afternoon, she said. There's business I've been putting off. He nodded once. Then I'll come too, he said, in a tone that was not a negotiation, and she decided, for reasons she was still constructing, to let him. The Elysium Vault was not, to the outside observer, a place of power. It occupied the lower levels of a converted warehouse at the south end of the harbor district, accessed through a door that looked like a loading bay and had no visible signage and was, in fact, the most exclusive supernatural commercial venue on the eastern seaboard. The membership wait list was 8 years long. The annual dues were the kind of number that made most senior financial professionals pause when they heard it. The auction house, at the center of the vault, had handled more high-tier mana artifacts in the last 3 years than the combined output of every other legitimate auction house on the continent. Zola had built it under the Lady Onyx identity at age 19, with the first significant revenue from Aether Corp. She built it because she needed a controlled environment for commerce. She did not want subject to existing guild oversight structures. It was hers, in the way that very few things were hers not inherited, not given, not assigned by someone else's judgment about what she deserved, but built, directly, from nothing, with her own hands and her own strategy, and the particular ruthlessness of someone who had decided that being underestimated was a resource. She brought Tariq there on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after the ceremony, because she had promised him something that she could deliver here, and because she had been putting it off and had run out of reasons to continue putting it off. The entrance hall recognized her through its manicheed security system and opened before she touched it. Tariq noticed this. DeAndre noticed this. The 3 of them walked in. Tariq took in the interior with the wide attention of someone seeing that level of opulence in person for the first time. DeAndre scanned the layout with the precise eye of someone who treated every room like a map. They had been in the main hall for perhaps 4 minutes. Tariq examined an item in one of the display cases with the careful appreciation of someone trying not to look as interested as he was, when a voice from behind said, "There she is, Sterling Rat with her garbage sister." Chris Chandler stood at the far end of the hall with 3 associates and an easy confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. He was broad-shouldered and fair, and wore a coat that cost more than most people's annual incomes. He pointed at Tariq with the lazy certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome. Security. His voice rang off the stone ceiling. That one stole a VIP credential last month. I've filed the complaint. Restrain him. Zola looked at Chris Chandler. She looked at the security personnel who had begun to move and then stopped. The motion arrested itself mid-step. The guard's eyes flicking to a point behind her before going very still. She did not look behind her. She knew what was there. "Mr. Chandler," said the vault's executive director, from the doorway behind the security station, moving toward them with the specific velocity of a man who understood that he was now in the most important professional moment of his career and needed to manage it correctly. He was gray-haired and precise and had been running this operation for 2 years under Lady Onyx's oversight. In all that time, he had never seen Lady Onyx walk through his front door in person. He reached them. He went to one knee. The hall was very quiet. "Lady Onyx," he said, "I apologize that you were not alerted to the presence of a party making false claims against a member of your family. This will be addressed immediately." He looked up at her. What would you like me to do? Chris Chandler's face was doing several things simultaneously. His associates were doing different things. The small, panicked moves people make when they realize they've walked into something they hadn't planned for at all. Tariq was very still beside her. She did not look at him yet, because she needed him to hear the next part without her expression influencing it. Mr. Chandler, she said, in the pleasant, direct tone she used for this category of conversation. Would you like to explain to the hall how a VIP credential that was reported stolen by your office ended up in the pocket of someone who had never held a vault membership? The silence that followed left the hall waiting. The credential, the vault's gargoyle arrays store 72 hours of high-definition mana imaging, she said. I had the relevant period from last month pulled this morning. Would you like me to display it on the main screen? She waited. She had the patience of someone who had learned patience in the mountains, under conditions that made waiting in comfortable buildings feel like recreation. Chris Chandler looked at her. He looked at the director on the floor. He looked at DeAndre, who was standing with the unmoving quality of someone who had decided not to be threatening, but was very visibly capable of being so. He looked at his associates, who were not going to be useful to him here. It was, I may have been mistaken about the, on your hands and knees. Mr. Chandler, she said, 3 circuits of the main hall. Then your family's membership in the Eastern Commerce Council will be reviewed, and we'll discuss what that review looks like, depending on how the next 5 minutes go. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the floor. And then, because the alternative was worse, he went to his hands and knees. The hall watched him make his circuits. DeAndre watched. His expression she had not catalogued before. Equal parts, appraisal, and something quieter now. Tariq watched. And when the 3rd circuit was complete, and Chris Chandler was helped to standing by his white-faced associates, Tariq looked at Zola with an expression she was going to remember for a long time. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting a very long time to feel safe. They ate at a small restaurant near the vault. Zola and Tariq sat with DeAndre, who had maneuvered himself into the outing with the comfortable inevitability of someone who had decided where he was going to be and was simply already there. The restaurant was harbor adjacent and loud with afternoon traffic. It served the kind of food that required specific knowledge to order well. Knowledge Zola had, and that Tariq deferred to her on. And DeAndre apparently had too, because he ordered without consulting the menu and the food arrived correctly. Tariq ate with the concentration he brought to most things. And somewhere in the 2nd course he said, without looking up from his food, Chris Chandler's family owns 4 buildings in the North Harbor district. My father has been trying to negotiate a lease reduction in one of them for 3 years. Chandler's family has been stonewalling because they knew Sterling couldn't afford to walk away. He paused. I assume that situation has changed. Zola looked at him. The Chandler family's Commerce Council membership is in review, she said. The review process includes an audit of all affiliated commercial agreements. He nodded, absorbing this. I don't want them destroyed, he said, carefully. I want the lease to be fair. She looked at him for a moment. He was a careful young man who had grown up inside the Sterling family dynamics and come out of it knowing that fairness was worth insisting on, even when it was not the most strategically optimal position. The audit will produce appropriate terms, she said. Fair terms are appropriate terms. He looked at her. Is that how you built everything? By defining appropriate terms and holding to them? She thought about this. She thought about the early years of Aether Corp. She thought about the negotiations she had walked away from when the terms were wrong. The ones she had held through multiple revisions until they were right. And the ones she had structured so completely, they never needed revision. Mostly, she said. Sometimes you have to demonstrate, in advance, that you are willing to destroy something if the terms are not met. And then the terms become appropriate fairly quickly. Tariq considered this. DeAndre looked at his food and said nothing, and she was beginning to understand that was his way of listening. The same focused attention he brought to everything else. That's frightening, Tariq said. Yes, she said. That's the point. He nodded slowly. He looked at her with the expression she was becoming familiar with, not quite a question, and not quite a statement. It was the look of a young man building a worldview and, to his cautious surprise, finding a peace he had needed. She thought about Mubarak and about what it meant to be the kind of person who was available rather than the kind who managed. This sitting in a harbor restaurant explaining negotiation leverage while Tariq ate carefully and paid attention was what available looked like in practice, and she did not mind it at all. Outside the window, the harbor moved with its winter traffic, careful and deliberate. The cold light on the water was the particular color of late afternoon in December on the northern coast, sharp and pale and specific. She thought she had been away from this long enough to have missed it without knowing she had missed it, and that coming back now was a small and real thing in a day that had been large and consequential, and that small and real things mattered too. The bill came. DeAndre paid it before either of them had reached for it, an efficient preemption from someone who had decided to do a thing and simply did it. Tariq looked at him. "Thank you," he said. DeAndre nodded. She thought that was the most words the two of them had exchanged all afternoon, and that it was entirely adequate. The afternoon after Elysium, she walked Tariq back to where the Sterling carriage was waiting on the upper harbor road. He walked beside her with the easy quiet of someone who had stopped performing anything, which was the first time she had seen him fully at rest since she arrived at the castle. "The Huihu," he said, when they were halfway up the road. "The Aether Corp badge." "Yes," she said. "Lady Onyx is you." "Yes." He was quiet for a while, processing this. She let him process it. "Is DeAndre Blackwood? Does he know?" "He figured it out at the ceremony," she said. "Before the revised terms were drafted. He hasn't told anyone," Tariq said. She looked at him. "I noticed he hasn't," she said. Tariq nodded. He was watching the harbor below them as they climbed the channel traffic and the light on the water and the vault's warehouse exterior, which from outside revealed nothing of what it contained. "I want to understand something," he said. "You built all of that while we were all living in the castle and treating you like—" He stopped. He looked at the water. "While we were treating you as though you were nothing." She thought about how to answer this in a way that was true without being designed to produce any particular effect. "I built it because I needed things that were mine," she said. "The Sterling family's opinion of me was irrelevant to that. The castle was irrelevant. The bloodline classification the family assigned to me was irrelevant." She paused. "What was relevant was what I actually was, and I knew what I actually was. And so everything else was noise." He looked at her. "Didn't it hurt?" he asked. "Simply, yes," she said. "But pain and irrelevance are compatible. Something can hurt and also not matter." He thought about this for a long time. They reached the carriage. The driver was waiting with the professional patience of someone for whom waiting was part of the job description. Tariq put his hand on the carriage door. He turned back to her. "I'm going to be better at this," he said. "When I have the position, I'm going to be better at seeing people for what they actually are." He said it simply and directly, the way he said most things, without decoration. She looked at him. He had been the only member of the Sterling family she'd found worth knowing, who had grown the best qualities she had seen in the least supportive environment, and who had developed his own judgment without anyone to value it, which was the hardest and most reliable way. She said, "I know you will." It was not reassurance. It was assessment. He knew the difference, and so he received it the right way, not as comfort, but as information, which was the highest compliment she could give. The Blood Moon Festival was the oldest of the Sterling observances, It was older than the castle, older than the current classification system, and older than the alliance structures the Sterlings had built. Lost and rebuilt over 4 centuries. It predated them as a family, if she was being precise, which she generally was. The ceremony had been performed at the Sterling estate every generation for as long as anyone had kept records. It centered on the chalice, a 4th century vessel mana inlaid in the original style, able to read and respond to bloodline classifications, and on the formal renewal of the bloodline's bond to its history. Every senior member of the family placed their hand on the chalice. The eldest child of the current generation poured wine into it. The head of family called down the blessing. It was ritual more than magic, continuity more than power. And Zola had not been invited for 16 years because she was not considered a member of the family. She was invited this year because Alistair had revised his understanding of several things after the Blackwood ceremony, and because Zelda had suggested, with the mild certainty of someone who knew the outcome already, that it would be a meaningful occasion. Kaelin and Vivian had been making preparations for 3 days. She knew this because Tariq told her in the careful, quiet way he passed along information he thought she needed. He was not gossiping or betraying, but flagging things with the instincts of a young man who had learned that information was the most reliable protection available to him. Kaelin's East Tower room, he said. On the morning before the festival, the men I mentioned, they were back again last night. Zola looked at him. What kind of signatures? I can't read the specifics. But heavy, suppressed, like something that's been mana-locked to keep it from resonating. She ran through the category of mana suppression in her head. It required active locking, not ambient suppression, the deliberate, ongoing measures used when you were transporting something that would cause problems if it were scanned. She also ran through the festival, the chalice, the assembly of the senior Sterling membership, all in one place, at one time. And what a person with Kaelin's ambitions and Kaelin's particular variety of impatience would try to do with that opening. Don't drink the wine tonight, she said. Tell Zelda. She paused. Don't tell father yet. Tariq nodded. He left. She sat for a moment, thinking about timing and the particular ugliness of someone who would poison a family gathering to seize power. Then she got up, messaged DeAndre, and went to find Zelda. Zelda was in the castle greenhouse, a glass and iron structure off the east wing added in the last century. It still smelled new compared with everything else in the castle. She was examining a specimen of blood orchid growing in a container she had brought herself. She looked up when Zola came in with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for precisely this moment. Kaelin, Zola said, I need to know what's in that room. Zelda set down her examination tool. I sent a member of my coven to assess the signatures last night, she said, discreetly. The locking is shadowbind pattern, 3rd-tier suppression. Competent, but not sophisticated. What's inside is a dispersal array. Zola was quiet for a moment. A dispersal array is a combat-scale magical device used for 2 purposes, suppressing mana abilities inside a contained area, and delivering a substance as an aerosol within that same space. What substance? The particular compound, most commonly used with dispersal arrays, targeting bloodline communities, Zelda said, is a mana inhibitor concentrate, broad spectrum, would affect everyone in a room with active bloodline traits. She paused, including enhanced sensory capability, so the person who activated it wouldn't need to worry about anyone detecting them in the immediate aftermath. Zola thought about 60 senior Sterling members in the Great Hall at the Blood Moon Festival, about the chalice in the center, about Kaelin in the East Tower room for 3 nights, with men whose mana signatures read as suppressed aggression, when, if I were Kaelin Sterling, Zelda said, I would activate it during the ceremonial wine pouring. Maximum confusion. Maximum distraction. The senior members would lose their abilities for approximately 4 hours. She paused, long enough for an external force to move in. Zola looked at her. He has external backing. 2 of the signatures in the tower room match a trafficking report I mentioned at dinner, Zelda said. The organization in the report deals in territory acquisition. They take positions of power in families that are in transition and manage the transition to their advantage. She picked up her examination tool again. Kalen has been in contact with them for approximately 7 months, since just after he became aware that the Blackwood Alliance might involve your participation. Zola thought about this. She thought about how long Kalen had been planning, and about the men in the tower, and about what would happen if she simply told Alistair and let the Sterling family handle it internally. She decided that was not the outcome she wanted. For both strategic and personal reasons, she had something else in mind. DeAndre has an enforcement team with him, she said. Standard Blackwood diplomatic escort. But they have operational clearance under the Alliance Treaty. Zelda looked at her. The treaty was signed 3 days ago. Yes, Zola said. The operational clearance under the revised terms includes a protective mandate for first-tier bloodline holders, which is me. She paused. Which means the Blackwood enforcement team has jurisdiction to intervene in any situation that constitutes a threat to my person or my bloodline designation. Zelda looked at her for a long moment. You thought of this when you were reviewing the treaty terms, Zelda said. I thought it might be useful, Zola said. Zelda made a sound that was not quite a laugh, something more admiring than that. Go right to DeAndre, she said. I'll handle the dispersal array. The festival began at dusk, as it always had. The great hall glowed with deep amber and crimson from mana-fed ceremony candles. The light moved differently than ordinary fire, richer and slower, and it shifted with the bloodlines of the people in the room. 63 senior Sterling members had arrived by the time the ceremony began, some traveling distances, some from local estates, all of them moving through the hall with the ease of people in a familiar space. The chalice stood at the center of the ceremonial table, exactly as described in the historical folios, a vessel of dark bronze with blood metal inlay running in spirals from base to rim, approximately 18 inches tall. Its surface gleamed with the faint resonance of something that had been mana-active for centuries. Zola stood with the family at the outer ring of the ceremony space. Tariq was beside her, as they had arranged. Zelda was somewhere in the background, the position she always occupied and from which she was most effective. DeAndre's people were at the entrance, and at 2 other points she had identified as the most logical access routes for an outside force operating on Kalen's behalf. DeAndre himself was standing at her right. He had arrived at the ceremony that way, though she had not told him to. She had decided to file this detail for later consideration. Kalen stood at the head of the ceremony table in the traditional position of the eldest Sterling heir. He looked confident. He looked like a man executing a plan he had worked on carefully and believed in. And she noted that confidence, more than anxiety, had a particular texture and a readable vulnerability she had learned to watch. He called for the wine. A server came forward with the ceremonial decanter. The wine was poured. 63 senior Sterling members raised their glasses. Vivian raised her glass too. She watched Zola over the rim of the glass. Her expression matched the one Zola had been cataloging all week, not triumph yet, but the anticipation of it. The held breath of someone who had arranged something and was waiting to see it land. She was drinking from her own glass. Zola noticed, not hesitating, not looking at Kalen for a signal. Drinking. She had her own information about what the wine contained. She was protected. Zola set her untouched glass down on the table beside her. She felt, rather than heard, Tariq do the same to her left. DeAndre, who had also not raised his glass, said, very quietly, "Now," she said. "One moment." She waited. She counted in her head, measuring the pre-activation resonance that would show in the mana field, roughly 30 seconds before a dispersal array triggered. She felt it. A faint shimmer. Low register. The kind that would be invisible to anyone whose bloodline sensitivity had not been specifically calibrated to detect it. She looked at Kalen. He had his hand in his coat pocket. "Now," she said. 3 things happened simultaneously. The first was the east wing corridor wall making the precise sound of a dispersal array being decommissioned by someone who knew what they were doing, which Zelda very much did. The second was that 6 Blackwood enforcement officers appeared in the Great Hall, not dramatically but efficiently, moving to position around Kalen with the practiced coordination of people who had been briefed on exactly where to be and when. The third was that Kalen Sterling's hand came out of his coat pocket, holding a small glass capsule. He looked at it with the expression of someone whose hand had produced the correct result for a situation that no longer existed as he had planned. He looked at Zola. She looked back at him, in the silence of the hall. With 63 senior Sterling members in various stages of lowering their wine glasses, she said, "Put it down." Kalen. He looked at the enforcement officers surrounding him. He looked at the door to the east corridor, which had produced 2 more Sterling officials she recognized as Blackwood Treaty Jurisdiction personnel. He looked at his coat pocket, which no longer contained anything useful. He looked at Vivian, who was doing the calculation she always did, and arriving, this time, at a result that visibly did not favor her. Kalen set the capsule on the table. He did it slowly, with the care of someone placing something fragile, or perhaps with the care of someone who was using the gesture to think, buying time, assessing the alliance treaty. He said, "Finally, gives Blackwood operational jurisdiction in Sterling territorial events only in cases of first-tier bloodline threat mitigation," Zola said, which is documented in the revised covenant terms signed 3 days ago and witnessed by both parties. She looked at him steadily. "A dispersal array targeting the ceremony hall of a gathering at which I am present constitutes a direct threat to a first-tier bloodline holder, under Section 7 of the revised treaty." He looked at her for a long time. She saw him revising, and then revising again, and then arriving at the place where there was nothing left to revise. "You planned this," he said. "I prepared for several possibilities," she said. "This one was fairly probable." The external forces Kalen had been working with the Territory Acquisition Organization that Zelda had identified from the trafficking report were brought in by the Blackwood enforcement team over the following hour. Having arrived at the castle's secondary entrance on a timeline consistent with a dispersal array activation that had not happened, they were not aggressive when intercepted, because the team that met them at the secondary entrance was double the size they had been briefed to expect, and because the organization, whatever its other qualities, was operationally rational and recognized a situation that had departed from its original parameters. Kalen's East Tower room was formally documented under the treaty's evidentiary provisions. The evidence was comprehensive. Vivian, when informed that the external organization's internal communications included 62 days of recorded planning, in which she was a named participant, did not deny her involvement. She looked at the documentation like someone seeing her own choices from the outside for the first time and, in that light, found them hard to account for. She did not cry. She sat with it. Zola found this. In a way she had not expected to find anything about Vivian. Almost worth noting, the deliberation was held in the formal Sterling Council chamber, attended by the senior members, and Zelda and DeAndre's principal treaty officer, and Alistair. He presided with the expression of a man finally doing something he should have done long ago, in circumstances that made him wish he had done it differently. Kalen was stripped of his inheritance position and placed under a formal sanction that included removal of his active bloodline certification. He was also required to relocate to a sanctioned territory. The Sterling family's version of exile. Vivian's membership in the Sterling family was formally dissolved, along with any financial claims she had held through that membership. The external organization's territory licenses in the eastern region were revoked through the Blackwood Treaty mechanism. The treaty officer said the process would take several months to complete, but was essentially inevitable. Alistair, at the end of the deliberation, looked at Zola and said the Jia Trung position. By tradition, it passes to the eldest qualified bloodline holder. He said it carefully, precisely. She understood it was as close as he could get to offering something that could not be unsaid or taken back. She looked at him. She thought about the folio in her cuff and the chalice and 16 years of being qualified without a family that could see it. No, she said. The word was not harsh. It was simply clear. Alistair blinked. Tariq, she said. He's better suited to it than I am. And more importantly, he'll be better for the family. He doesn't use people as resources, and he understands the difference between authority and respect. She paused. Give it to Tariq. I'll support the transition in whatever capacity is useful. But I am not the head of this family. In the silence that followed, Tariq, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the council table, said nothing. He looked at Zola. She looked at him. He nodded once, not in surprise, not in gratitude exactly, but in the specific acknowledgement of someone receiving a thing they have been moving toward without knowing it, the recognition of a direction they were already facing. Alistair looked from one to the other. Then, at the formal council record in front of him, he wrote Tariq's name, signed it, and then it was done. DeAndre found her in the castle courtyard afterward. It was dark now. Properly dark, the blood moon large and deep red in the sky above the Sterling towers. The light moved through the old stone walls and made the whole place look different from before. Warmer and older and somehow less heavy, as though something that had been pressing down on it had been redistributed. She was sitting on the stone railing that ran along the east side, looking up at the moon, and she was not thinking about the chalice or the treaty, or Kaelin's expression, or Vivian's silence. She was thinking about a 6-year-old in a snowstorm who had learned that night to generate her own warmth. She was thinking about everything that had happened after that, and about what it meant to arrive at a place you'd been moving toward for a very long time. He sat down beside her, not on the railing, but on the wall behind it, which was perhaps 6 inches lower, so that they were close to the same height. She looked at him. He looked at the moon. I need to ask you something, he said. You said you had been looking for me in the harbors, she said. For 3 days before the ceremony. Yes. Why? He looked at her then, and the expression was the one she had been trying to classify since the ceremony hall, the stripped one, the one without protocol or positioning, the one that was simply what it was. Because I met someone at a harbor in Dorset 2 months ago, he said. She told me the mana signature in the artificial supply market was going to shift in the next 18 months. And she was right. And I went back to Dorset to find her, and she wasn't there. And I found out she had gone south to the northern coast harbors. And I followed. She looked at him. 2 months ago, she said, I was doing market research. At Dorset Harbor, you were arguing with a shipping broker about supply routing, he said, for 40 minutes. You were right about every calculation. The broker was an idiot. She thought about this. She thought about what it meant that a person who was the heir to the Blackwood Empire had spent 2 months tracking the movement of a woman he'd argued with about mana supply routing, and about the Blackwood family's reputation for being very thorough about things they decided were worth being thorough about, and about the fact that he had introduced himself at a treaty ceremony by kneeling, which was not exactly a standard diplomatic protocol. The dinner, she said. You invited me to dinner. At the ceremony, he said. Yes, that was 10 days ago. He looked at her. The invitation is still available. She looked at the moon. It was very red and very large, and the light it was putting through the sterling courtyard was doing something unusual to the old stone, making it look like the stones were breathing, which was an effect she had only read about in the folio materials, a response the old mana-channeled buildings had to first-tier bloodline activation in their vicinity. She thought that was interesting. She thought a lot of things were interesting right now. Ask me again tomorrow, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, why tomorrow? Because today I disbanded a coup attempt, revised a treaty, dissolved a family membership, and established the next Sterling Gia Trung. She said, I'd like to eat dinner before I make any more large decisions. He said nothing for a moment. Then, that's reasonable. She looked at him. His expression had shifted again. Something she was beginning to understand was how he responded to things that he found funny, but was not going to perform finding funny. A very slight change in the set of his mouth. Gone, before it fully arrived. She thought she was going to pay attention to that, and to the other things she was cataloguing about how he responded to things, and to what that catalogue was building toward. But that was for tomorrow, she thought, after DeAndre had gone. About the chalice. It was still in the Great Hall. The festival had been suspended after Kaelin's restraint and the external organization's interception, and the ceremony had not been completed. The chalice had remained on the table through the council deliberation, and was presumably still there now. In the dark of the hall, the candles burned down to their mana feed basings. The light it produced, dimming but not gone. She went back to the hall. The household staff had cleared the tables but not the ceremonial items. The chalice stood at the center of the ceremonial table where it had been placed at dusk. Still active, still resonating in the old way. She walked to it. She stood over it for a moment. The vessel was 400 years old and had read bloodlines since before the taxonomy that classified her existed. She placed her hand against its surface. It was not the formal gesture of the ceremony or the bloodline test procedure, just her palm against the metal of something genuinely old. The resonance under her hand was warm, complex, and deep in the way of very old things. It was doing something she did not fully have language for, a recognition neither quite physical nor quite emotional, but somewhere in between. The specific sensation of something that had been looking for something and found it. She thought about being 6, about the snowstorm and the cold she had survived by generating her own heat. She thought about doing something she had not been taught and should not have been able to do, and yet had done. She thought about that 6-year-old. She thought about what she would say to her. Now, with the full information available, she thought you will be very cold for a long time, and then you will be warm. The warmth will be yours in a way the cold could not take from you, and that will make the cold worth it. You are going to be all right. She stood at the table for a while longer with her hand on the chalice. She felt the resonance move through her palm, up her arm, and into her chest, where it did something complicated and very specific. Then she lifted her hand. She turned off the remaining mana candles and left the hall in the dark and went upstairs to sleep. The morning after the council deliberation, the morning after the festival, the morning after the chalice and the courtyard and the conversation under the blood moon, Alistair Sterling came to her door again. He knocked again. She opened it again. He looked older than he had on the night she arrived, though only 8 days had passed. It was not a physical aging so much as the wear of a man who had carried a structural dishonesty for 16 years, had it resolved at significant cost, and was now adjusting to the new weight. He had papers in his hand. The council documentation, he said, for the Gia Trung transition. She took them. She looked at them briefly. The formal record showed Tariq's name in Alistair's handwriting and the council signatures below. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. He said, "I know this isn't. I know you don't want anything from me." She looked back at him. She thought about the conversation she had had with Vivian in the conservatory. About Tariq. About what was available to her, and what she had already decided not to want. And she thought about what she actually wanted to say to Alistair Sterling. The thing that was truest and most direct and least decorated. "You made me survive," she said. He blinked. "I'm not saying that excuses it," she said. "I'm saying it's a true thing. I became what I am because I had to, and I had to because of what you did. The two things are connected. I'm not grateful for it, but I'm not going to pretend the connection doesn't exist." He was very still. "What I want from you," she said, "is what I told you before. Use Tariq well. Let him be what he actually is instead of what's convenient for the family narrative. That's available to you, and it's worth doing." She held the papers up slightly. "I'll have my counsel review these and return them to you by end of week." She closed the door. She stood on her side of the door for a moment, thought about what had just been said, and decided it was the truth. That truth was enough. Zelda found her in the castle library the morning after the deliberation. She came in without knocking. She had never knocked. In all the years Zola had known her, because she had explained once that knocking was for people who were uncertain of their welcome, and she was never uncertain of hers, and sat in the chair, across from the reading table, and folded her hands and looked at Zola with the expression she used when she had something to say and was deciding how to say it. Zola set down the document she was reviewing and waited. "The chalice," Zelda said. "When you touched it last night." Zola looked at her. "You felt it," Zelda said. "I know, because I was watching the mana field in the hall change when your hand made contact. The resonance pattern it was one of the older patterns, the ones the pre-taxonomy materials documented as exclusive to first-tier activation." She paused. "How long have you been able to feel things through objects?" "Since I was 12, Zola said. "The first time I touched something with a significant mana signature, in the mountains. I didn't have language for it. "Does it hurt?" Zelda asked. And the question was the same one Tariq had asked about something else, the same quality of direct caring inquiry, which was a thing she had learned Zelda did under the efficiency and the authority cared. "Specifically and practically. Not hurt," Zola said. "Resonate. Like a sound that's very close to a frequency you already carry." Zelda nodded. She was quiet for a moment. "The old texts describe it," she said, "for first-tier holders. They called it memory touch. The object carries a record of what it has witnessed, and the bloodline that resonates with it can access portions of that record." She paused. "What did you feel from the chalice?" Zola thought about the resonance under her palm, the warmth of it, the complexity, the recognition, continuity, she said. "A very long record, unbroken." Zelda looked at her steadily. "Yes," she said. "That's what 400 years feels like, through something that has been present for all of it." She stood up. She did something unusual. Then she put her hand briefly on Zola's shoulder, which was not a thing she did often. The gesture of it, deliberate and specific. "You should have had people who knew what you were a long time ago," she said. "I'm sorry we didn't find each other sooner." Zola looked at her. This woman, who was 40 or 400, who had been her first genuinely safe adult relationship, who had walked into the Sterling Great Hall and looked at a lacquered box and thrown the weight of everything she was behind the word of a woman in a shorn coat. "We found each other when we found each other," Zola said. "That's when it was going to happen." Zelda took her hand back. She looked, for a moment, like she was going to say something else, and then decided not to. She left the library. Zola sat with the resonance of the conversation for a while, and then she picked up the document and continued working. The formal Blackwood inquiry into Kaelin's territorial conspiracy took 11 days to process. Zola was present for 4 of them. As the treaty jurisdiction event had been initiated on her behalf and required her formal testimony in the Blackwood documentation, she gave her testimony with the precision she applied to everything. Not more, not less, not dressed up with interpretation. Just the exact record of what had occurred and the order in which it happened. The inquiry officer was a woman named Dasha, who had been doing this work for 30 years and carried the quiet steadiness of someone used to judging many accounts over decades. She listened to Zola's testimony without expression and asked exactly 3 follow-up questions, which Zola answered the same way she had given the initial account. At the end of the session, Dasha looked up from her notes and said, "Your bloodline classification was confirmed concurrent with the operational threat to the ceremony. You coordinated a protective response using treaty mechanisms you had identified during the classification review." She paused. "You had read the treaty appendix before the ceremony." "Yes," Zola said. "In the 3 hours before the signing." Dasha made a note. "For the record," she said, "the revised treaty terms you negotiated represent a significant improvement over the original draft from the Sterling family's perspective." She looked at Zola over her notes. "Whoever drafted the original failed to flag the classification cross-reference. The original Sterling Council," Zola said. "It was working from a template that hadn't been updated in 40 years. The pre-taxonomy notation in the appendix requires specialized training. You have specialized training," Dasha said. "I taught myself," Zola said. Dasha made another note. She looked up again. "The inquiry will close in approximately 2 weeks," she said. "The external organization's territory licenses will be formally revoked at that point. The criminal referral for the principals will take longer." She paused. "On behalf of the Blackwood administrative team, I want to express this is not formal. This is just me. That this situation was handled with exceptional competence." She looked at Zola with the specific attention of someone who had assessed many things and reached a precise judgment. "I'd also like to say that in 30 years of treaty work, I have not seen a bloodline classification that's significant discovered that late in a person's life. I don't know what the circumstances were that prevented it from being identified earlier." She paused. "But I imagine they weren't pleasant." Zola looked at her. "They weren't," she said. "I'm sorry," Dasha said, in the simple, direct manner of someone who was not performing sympathy, but offering it, which was a different thing. Zola nodded. She gathered her materials and left the inquiry room and walked down the Blackwood administrative corridor without stopping until she reached the small garden outside the east entrance, which was empty at that hour. She sat on a bench, looked at the winter-dead plants, and thought about what it meant to have someone who was not required to say a thing say it anyway. She found Vivian on the 7th day after the council decision. That was the day before Vivian was required to formally depart the Sterling estate. She had not planned to seek Vivian out. She had been walking through the castle grounds, getting familiar with the place in the way she had learned to get familiar with any territory she was going to operate in, mapping exits and angles and the particular quality of different kinds of light at different times of day. She had found Vivian in the South Conservatory, a glass and iron structure similar to the greenhouse but older and less maintained. Vivian sat in a chair with a cup of tea and looked at the dormant garden outside with no particular expression. Vivian looked up when Zola came in. She did not look hostile. She looked tired and, oddly, a little younger than when Zola had first seen her. Her careful composure had slipped into something else. Not precisely composure, and not its opposite. "I'm not here to say anything in particular," Zola said. "I was walking past." Vivian looked at her for a moment. "You could have destroyed me," she said. "At Elysium. In the inquiry." You could have made the council decision significantly worse for me. Zola pulled a chair from the corner and sat down across from her. Yes, she said. Why didn't you? Zola thought about it. The question deserved a true answer, because it wouldn't have changed anything that needed to change. She said, what needed to change was already changed. Adding more consequence to yours wouldn't have changed what was done to me, or what I built because of it. She paused. I didn't build what I built for revenge, she said. I built it because I needed something that couldn't be taken from me. And that's what a thing you build from nothing becomes. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She looked at her tea. I was jealous of you when we were young, she said. When you were gone, which is strange, because you weren't here. People can be jealous of absences, Zola said, especially if the absence left a space they had to fill. Vivian looked at her. Something passed through her expression, not forgiveness exactly, neither asking for it nor receiving it, but something more honest than either, the simple acknowledgement of a complex reality by two people who had been shaped by it and were still standing. Tariq's going to be good at this, Vivian said. He's too careful to be careless, and too principled to be stupid. Yes, Zola said. She stood up. She looked at Vivian for a moment. This was the woman who had been her sister in name for 15 years, and her adversary in practice for that whole time. She thought about what she actually felt, and found it was neither warm nor cold, but something more complicated. The feeling of looking at someone who had made choices out of fear and scarcity, had not found a better option, and might, with enough space and time away from the family that taught her to treat people as competitors, become someone different. Take care of yourself, Zola said. It was the simplest thing she could say, and the truest. She left the conservatory, and did not look back. She had dinner with DeAndre on the 8th day. Not at the castle. Neither of them suggested the castle, as though by mutual unspoken agreement that the castle carried too much ongoing significance for a first dinner. They went to a small restaurant in the harbour town nearest the Sterling estate, the sort of unassuming place that was warm, served good food, and had windows onto water frozen at the edges. Harbour traffic, moving carefully through channels, the harbour authority kept clear for winter. He arrived before her, which she had not expected. He sat at the window table when she came in, wearing civilian clothes instead of Blackwood, formal, a look that took a moment to line up with his public presentation. He stood as she approached with the easy, unself-conscious habit of someone who simply stands for people, not for show. They sat. The restaurant was half full, winter quiet. The harbour traffic had thinned, and the clientele was a mix of permanent residents and the few travellers with reason to be on the northern coast in December. Nobody recognized them, which was not entirely surprising. Without context, she did not read as Lady Onyx or the newly confirmed first-tier Sterling. And he, without his formal escort and Blackwood insignia, did not read as the heir to the largest supernatural territory on the eastern seaboard. They were just two people by a harbour window, a plain anonymity she realized she had not felt in a long time. You taught yourself the pre-taxonomy notation, he said, when the food had arrived and they had established that neither of them was going to talk around the things they were actually thinking. Over about 8 months, she said. When I was setting up the vault, I needed to understand what the old materials were classifying and why, and the published translations were inconsistent. You built the vault when you were 19, he said. Yes. While running Aether Corp, the corp was 2 years old. I had reliable management in place for the day-to-day. He looked at her. Where did the initial capital come from? She looked at him. He looked back at her steadily, which was, she was finding, his consistent approach, direct attention, waiting, no performance of patience, but genuine patience underneath. A man named Mubarak, she said. He found me in the mountains when I was 6. He raised me. She paused. He doesn't have significant financial resources. The initial capital was his savings, which he offered without conditions or expectation of repayment. It was approximately 12,000 credits. She thought about Mubarak, who was currently in his territory in the northwest, who she had sent a message to the morning after the Blackwood ceremony, telling him that things had gone well and that she would visit in the spring, and who had sent back a reply in his direct way. Good. Be careful. Don't let them get inside your head. She missed him. She found, not as a vague ache, but as a clear, present thing. That felt odd. She had long learned that missing someone who was still reachable was not a useful occupation. What do you do for him now? DeAndre asked. I bought back the land his pack lost 20 years ago in a border dispute, she said, and had the territorial rights reclassified under the pre-taxonomy standards, which gave them about 3 times the formal status they had under the current system, which means they have a seat on the Eastern Territorial Council that they didn't have before. She looked at her food. That's not a repayment. That's just, I had the tools to do it. And it was right to do it. He was quiet for a moment. When she looked up, he held her gaze with the expression she'd been cataloging. It was the look she was learning to read, assessing and filing things carefully. The first night at the ceremony, he said, when you set the ring down and walked away, you weren't angry. No, she said. I was making a point about what I was and wasn't available to be used for. Being angry would have undercut it. I know, he said. I was there. He paused. I was also there when you looked at Tariq across the dinner table on the first night and spent the next 6 days building a situation where he could be safe in his own family. She looked at him. He was very direct. She had noticed this from the beginning. But the directness had a quality to it that she had been slow to fully identify, not aggression, not performance, but the specific directness of someone who said what they observed, because they had decided that accuracy was more valuable than comfort, and had found, over time, that the people who could tolerate that were the people worth being around. You notice a lot, she said. Yes, he said. She thought about this. She thought about 2 months ago at Dorset Harbour, arguing with a shipping broker about supply routing, not knowing that anyone specific was watching. The dinner, she said. He said, which was not a word, but was a sound that contained his attention. Is this it? He looked at her. If you want it to be, he said. She looked at the harbour through the window, dark water moving between its frozen edges and harbour authority lights strung along the channel. It was the particular quiet of a winter harbour town at night, when the traffic had thinned and the cold made the air clear, so she could see farther than usual. I want to tell you something, she said. You don't have to, I know I don't have to, she said. That's why I'm choosing to. She looked at him. I built everything I built because I needed things that were mine, things that couldn't be taken from me because no one else's judgment was involved in their existence. Aether Corp, the vault, the classification research, the land for Mubarak's pack. She paused. I am very careful about what I allow to be external to me, what I allow to depend on other people's decisions or other people's choices. He was very still, watching her. This is me telling you that, she said, not as a warning, as a fact. He was quiet for a moment. Then I understand, he said, and she thought he did, which was itself a piece of information she was adding to the catalogue. I am also, he said, very careful about what I commit to, for reasons that are mine and that I will tell you about if you want to hear them. Or not. If you don't, he looked at her steadily. I would like to not be careful. In this specific situation. In the usual way. I would like to be careful in a different way, the kind that is about paying attention over a long time, rather than the kind that is about maintaining distance. She looked at him. The harbor light was coming through the window at an angle that was doing something to the space between them, making it seem both larger and smaller than it was. She thought about Mubarak and the mountains and 12,000 credits and 8 months of learning a notation system that most people had let become inaccessible. She thought about what it felt like to build something that was entirely your own, and about what it might feel like to build something that was not entirely your own, and whether those were mutually exclusive. "I haven't been careful about you," she said, in quite the way I'm usually careful about things. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I've noticed." She looked at him, this man who had tracked her across harbor towns for 2 months, and knelt at a ceremony and waited out 11 days of inquiry without pressure, and showed up early to a dinner in civilian clothes and said what he observed instead of what was safe, and she thought that there was a thing she was doing right now that she had done before, with tools and territories and bloodline folios and treaty appendices. She was recognizing something that was exactly what it appeared to be, with no hidden components and no structural compromises, and deciding to trust what she had assessed. She picked up her glass. "Tell me about the reasons you're careful," she said. He began to speak, and she listened. Outside the harbor it was dark. The ice moved slowly at the channel edges, and the lights ran long reflections across the water. It was the kind of evening that mattered in the small way. Evenings matter when they are the beginning of something you have not yet named. 3 weeks later, the Blackwood inquiry closed. The criminal referrals for the external organization's principals were filed with the Eastern Continental Authority. Kalen's territory sanction was formally registered. The Sterling family began the process of transitioning the Jia Truong position to Tariq. That involved a documentation process Tariq was navigating with careful efficiency and occasional questions sent to Zola via a private channel she had set up for that purpose. She answered the questions and did not manage the process, which was the distinction she had decided on. Available, not controlling. Available was the word Mubarak had used when she asked him once, during one of the hard years, what a good parent actually did. And he had thought about it for a long time before saying, "You make yourself available, not the decisions, not the outcomes. Available." She thought he had been right then, and she thought he was right now. She went back to the Rusted Anchor on a Tuesday. Rafe was behind the bar. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the thing it had done when she left, the expression of someone who has known many people and can tell, from the specific way a person carries themselves when they walk through a door, what has happened to them since they last left. She hung up her coat. She tied on the apron. "Good?" he asked. She thought about the treaty, and the chalice, and the dinner by the harbor, and Tariq's message that morning about the transition documentation, and Mubarak's reply to her spring visit plans, which had been good. "Bring the Blackwood boy. I want to see if he's worth the trouble." "Good," she said. She picked up a glass and began to polish it, and looked around the bar at the afternoon crowd, which was small and various and entirely unconcerned with bloodline classifications and treaty revisions and the politics of supernatural families, and thought that this was one of the things she valued about the Rusted Anchor, that it was a place where she was simply a woman who was good at this job and kept the peace and poured an honest drink, and that this, like everything else she had built, was hers. She had carried 3 bloodlines for 22 years. She had carried them through mountains and hunters and cities and harbors and treaty halls and the great hall of a castle that had tried to kill her by attrition. And none of the people who had looked at her during those years, not the Sterling family, not the hunters, not the brokers and clients and guild officials who had moved through her orbit without knowing who they were dealing with, had recognized what they were seeing. She had not needed them to. She had known. She had found that knowing was the one thing no one could give or take, and that it did not depend on anyone else's generosity or judgment. It could not be taken from you in a snowstorm. It could not be dissolved from a family registry. It could not be forfeited in a treaty negotiation or suppressed by a dispersal array or eaten out of a lacquered box. It was hers, and it had always been hers. And everything she had been built from it. And now the world knew too. And that was not, she decided, the most important part. It was simply the part that came last. Mubarak's reply to the spring visit message arrived 2 days after she returned to the rusted anchor. He sent paper correspondence. Always. In his clear, upright handwriting. Because he had never trusted message relay services, and because a letter, he had told her once, required the person writing it to think through what they meant before they put it down, which was a discipline worth maintaining. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first described the current condition of the Pack territory in detail, which was his way of telling her that things were stable. The second asked about Tariq, about whom she had written briefly, and said good instincts. That one, if the family doesn't ruin them. The third paragraph said, you did what you went to do. I know, because you wrote me a letter that sounds like someone who has finished something rather than someone who is in the middle of it. Come in the spring. Bring the Blackwood boy, if you want. I want to see if he's worth the trouble. She read the letter twice. She folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, near where the Aether Corp badge lived. That pocket was where she kept the things she needed to be near. She went back to work. Zelda came to the rusted anchor on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the festival, which was unusual. Zelda came to Zola when she came, in quiet and private contexts, not to places where she would be recognized, because the supreme witch of the Crimson Coven, appearing in a public harbor bar, created a specific category of attention that was not always useful. She sat at the end of the bar in robes that were not her formal coven robes, but the deep blue-gray of her personal wardrobe, which she wore when she was not performing anything. And Zola poured her tea. Zelda did not drink alcohol, had not, for reasons she had explained once, and Zola had not needed to ask about again, and they sat in the quiet of the bar's Thursday evening traffic, which was lighter than the weekend and more comfortable. Tariq sent me a letter, Zelda said, asking about Coven advisory resources for new Jia Trung transitions. She held the tea with both hands. It was a very well-structured letter. He's good at structure, Zola said. He learned it as a survival mechanism. He's going to be good at governance. Zelda looked at her. And you, she said. What are you going to be good at? From here, Zola thought about the Vault and Aether Corp and the classification confirmation and DeAndre and Mubarak's letter in her coat pocket. The same things I've always been good at, she said, building things that last. Zelda looked at her for a long moment with the assessment she brought to everything. The look that was not warm or cold, but simply attentive. And then she said, the Blackwood heir is in the harbor. He has been for 3 days. He's staying at the inn near the south gate, and he's been very quiet about it. Zola looked at her. I know, she said. Zelda raised an eyebrow. He sent me a letter, Zola said. When he arrived, I told him I would let him know when I was ready. Zelda considered this. And are you? Yes, Zola said. She finished the glass she was cleaning. She hung up the cloth. She looked at Rafe, who was watching from the far end with the expression he always had when significant things were happening. The expression of someone who has seen many significant things and is content to witness rather than to intervene. I'll be back in a bit, she said. He nodded. She got her coat. She went to find DeAndre at the inn near the south gate. He had come back to the harbor and waited 3 days without pressure, and she had decided he was going to be worth the trouble. The harbor was quiet at this hour. The channel traffic had slowed and the ice at the edges had crept in another inch since morning, and the harbor authority lights were on their winter schedule. warmer and closer spaced than the summer configuration. She walked the south dockside and thought about the first time she had walked it. 6 years ago. She had nothing to her name then except a small pack, and the kind of clear resolve that comes from starting over when everything else feels built on a lie. She had found the rusted anchor on that first walk. She had found Rafe, who had given her a job without requiring a full account of herself. She had found the harbor, which was a place where people moved in and out with a regularity that made no one's presence either remarkable or expected. She had found the particular quality of a place that held you without requiring you to be held. She thought about all of that as she walked. She thought about what it meant to have built something there, and now to be walking away, not forever, not entirely, but the way you leave a part of your life when one chapter ends and another is starting. The inn near the south gate had a light in the front window. She could see it from the dockside path, warm and specific against the winter dark. She thought about Mubarak's letter, about Tariq's careful handwriting in the transition documents, and about the chalice's resonance under her palm in the dark hall. She thought about what it meant to have carried 3 bloodlines for 22 years and now to be walking toward something that was not mere survival, but a real choice, made with full information, her own judgment. And that particular clarity she had learned over time and would not accept being substituted. The inn door was warm to the touch. She opened it. She walked in. She did not tell anyone that she was going to the inn. She did not need to. She walked the South Harbor streets in the winter dark, coat buttoned, the harbor to her left and the town to her right, the inn's light ahead. She thought about all the ways. Over 22 years. She'd learned to calculate what was worth fighting for or building, and what justified the cost. The cold, the hunters, the long years of staying invisible. She thought about the 12,000 credits Mubarak had given her from his savings, no conditions, no repayment expected. Only his plain. Here is what I have. I trust you to build something with it. And then she thought about what she had actually built with that gift. She realized that building had been one kind of answer and choosing another, and that as of tonight, she was choosing not because choosing was better or worse, but because it used a different muscle, one she had not practiced, and she was willing to learn how to use it properly. She thought she was willing to practice. The inn door was warm. She pushed it open. DeAndre was at the table nearest the fire with a book he wasn't reading. His eyes lifted before she'd fully entered, and he moved to her with the immediate attention of someone who had been waiting and knew the wait was over. He set the book down. He stood. She looked at him across the small room, the fire, the table, the winter quiet common room, this specific person who had tracked her across harbor towns. Waited 3 days without pressure, and instinctively knew when to speak and when to stay quiet. She thought she'd assessed him carefully and kept reassessing, and every time the verdict came back the same, he was exactly what he appeared to be. And she had built her whole life on trusting those assessments. So this one was no different. She crossed the room. She sat down. He sat across from her. "You're here," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with all his attention. Then his expression shifted into something she hadn't seen before, open and specific. Something she'd need time to catalog. "Good," he said. It was a simple word. It landed exactly right. She thought about Mubarak writing that word at the end of his letters. Good, and about how much a simple word could carry when it was used by someone who meant precisely what they said. She thought that she was in a room with another person who meant precisely what they said, which was rarer than it should have been, and was, she decided, exactly sufficient. "Tell me about the Blackwood territory," she said. "The parts no one writes about in the official materials." He looked at her. Something in his expression settled into the particular warmth of someone who has been waiting to talk about something they actually care about and has finally been asked. He began to speak. She listened. Outside the inn, the harbor was dark and cold, moving slowly in its winter channels. The south gate lights reflected in the water in long, broken lines. It felt like the start of something neither of them had named yet, which she thought was exactly the right way to begin.